So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which is a lecture by Professor Angela Garcia of Stanford University. I'm Charles Briggs. I'm the interim director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues and also professor of anthropology and the co-director of the UC Berkeley, UCSF Joint PhD program in medical anthropology. First thing I'd like you to ask you to do, if you have any of those little funny things on your desk there that make noise, you might want to silence them before we begin. I'd like to also start by saying that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Cochin Ohlone, which was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Every member of our community has benefited from and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the founding of the university in 1868. This land acknowledgement provides us with an admittedly inadequate means of affirming Indigenous sovereignty and our commitment to hold Berkeley much more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. So today's event is also co-sponsored by the Center for Ethnographic Research, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Berkeley School of Public Health, the Othering and Belonging Institute, and the Latinx Research Center. I would like to also particularly thank our wonderful Deborah Lustig and Max van der Varker, to whom we not only owe the expert organization of this event, but ISSI's vitality as well. Now, I'm going to introduce Professor Garcia, then she'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have QA. For those, many of you who are on there joining us by Zoom, thank you. You can use the Q&A function to be able to pose your questions, and we will ask them here. So what a great pleasure to be able to welcome Angela Garcia back to Berkeley. She's no stranger. She received her bachelor's degree here, and she's an affiliate of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. She's currently a professor of anthropology and chair of the department at Stanford University. In 2010, she published The Pastoral Clinic, Addiction and Dispossession Along the Rio Grande, which won the Victor Turner Prize for Ethnographic Writing for the Society for Humanistic Anthropology and the Penn Center USA UC Press Award for Exceptional First Book. At the same time, it is a must-read work for scholars in medical anthropology. It was widely read across anthropological fields as a work that pushes the boundaries of ethnographic writing. She writes about patient prisoners, bound not only by heroin addiction, but by, in her words, logics, routines, and practices of medical and juridical regimes, unquote, in Hispano communities in northern New Mexico. From rich narratives centering on her own time working in a treatment facility to close portraits of the lives, loves, families, and deaths, these come alive in their rich complexity, pushing beyond frames of individual and cultural pathology. She weaves history, political economy, and phenomenology together in the rich colors of the famous blankets that are woven in the Chimayo region in ways that raise profound questions without pretending to offer easy answers. As readers, Dr. Garcia challenges us to face unsettling conundrums. How can a parent injecting a teenager with heroin or shooting up on the graves of recently parted friends be considered acts of care, modes of reparation for the racist regime in which rich white landowners, forest rangers, police, prison guards, and drug addiction professionals help enforce the longue durée of dispossession from vast grant lands that sustained communities? The Pastoral Clinic was a hard act to follow, but Dr. Garcia's 2024, The Way That Leads Among the Lost, Life, Death, and Hope in Mexico City, published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, more than measures up to the challenge. Here, Dr. Garcia holds readers' feet to the fire. Acts of care by relatives, including spouses as well as parents, lie in handing over addicts to anexos, private, unlicensed drug recovery centers known for their illegal and violent practices. A mother reports how the servers that she called pulled her teenage son to his feet, secured him in a headlock, zip-tied his hands behind his back, placed a hood over his head, and dragged him out the front door. This rough treatment pales in comparison with the forms of isolation, violence, and psychological abuse that awaited him in the anexo. But Professor Garcia researched a wide range of anexos in terms of geography, size, philosophical orientation, gender composition, and methods of engaging the anexalos, the interns. The care and experimentation evident in the final product became apparent to me over the years as I listened to her explore different analytics and different modes of ethnographic writing in a series of talks. The result is a remarkable example of ethnographic writing that follows the lives of people who live and work in the annexos and in their shadow, Mexico's drug war, narco trafficking violence, the dislocation of the urban poor by bureaucrats, capitalists, and gangs alike, and over half a century of social movements to counter this violence and demand better futures. The way that leads among the lost refuses any neat answers or totalizing strategies, constantly coming at ethnographic scenes through different angles and in different registers. The book includes a personal register in which Dr. Garcia revisits scenes from her own childhood and adult life, thwarting any ascription of the book to distant anthropological perspectives on addiction and contemporary Mexico, and providing an ethnographic refusal to reproduce familiar stereotypes. Written for a general audience, the book's analytic dimensions emerge subtly, distilling insights and unfolding organically at points of intersection where these ethnographic and personal trajectories come into contact. If you ain't read it, you really ought to get into the book. Dr. Garcia has published in leading journals in anthropology as well as in social text, transcultural psychiatry, Alcoholism Treatment Quarterly, and the British Journal of Psychiatry. Beyond receiving her BA here of summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, and with the Kroger Prize, her awards include the Sterling Prize from the Society for Psychological Anthropology, NSF, NIMH, and Ford Foundation pre-doctoral fellowships for her doctoral research, and a UC President's postdoctoral fellowship. She appears frequently in the media. Always on the move, she's presenting new research today, and her title is Cathartic Writing, Collectivity, and Care Among Undocumented Mexican Immigrants. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Angela Garcia.
Thank you, Charles, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me, Max for providing support, and Deborah for also providing support and getting me here today. It's wonderful to be back. I consider Berkeley my intellectual home, and so much of the work that I have done over the years has been formulated through my conversations with people here over the past, gosh, now almost 2 decades. So thank you for inviting me back. So this talk continues my long-standing interest in questions of violence, vulnerability, and care in marginalized communities. And it emerges from my ethnographic research in Mexico City, where for the past decade, I've been studying informal addiction treatment centers called annexos, which literally in English means annex. Annexos are run by and for Mexico's low-income communities, and they're controversial for their use of coercion and violence as methods for recovery. My work has focused on annexos social and therapeutic practices, exploring how they conjure up, amplify, and rework contemporary forms of affliction and violence in Mexico City's peripheral neighborhoods. I challenge the prevailing view of annexos as punitive or criminal institutions and reveal them to be a microcosm that makes profoundly visible the unequal and precarious world that Mexico is today. The culmination of this decade-long research project is my book, The Way That Leads Among the Lost, as well as a binational research project that spans the United States and Mexico. That project, which I will speak about today, focuses on a little-known therapeutic community that began in Mexico City in 1991 and which quickly took root among undocumented immigrants living in the United States. This therapeutic community is known as Grupos de Cuatro y Quinto Paso, or fourth and fifth step groups. Simply stated, fourth and fifth step groups are an unofficial offshoot of Alcoholics Anonymous, an organization which has distanced itself from fourth and fifth step groups, calling them cultish, ineffectual, and harmful. Part of this concern is that these groups are often tied to annexos, meaning annexos often employ aspects of the fourth and fifth step model. Unlike traditional 12-step programs, 4th and 5th step groups rigorously practice steps 4 and 5, the so-called scary steps of 12 steps, which encourage self-awareness and confession. To become a full-fledged member of the group, one must go on a grueling 3-day ritual known as una experiencia, an experience. This talk describes one such experience that took place in Northern California forest in 2022. It focuses on their ritual of writing that is the centerpiece of the experience. What I hope to show in this talk is that this writing ritual is far more than a tool for self-expression or self-care. It is also a medium for collectivity and critique, and it helps us to examine, among other things, the myriad forms of violence that accompany being undocumented in the United States today. So before I launch into my discussion of the experience, I just want to provide a little bit of background on 4th and 5th step groups. And this background emerges entirely from my ethnographic research, because when I began studying these groups over 10 years ago, there were no published scholarly literature on them. There were some sites on the web that usually called them cultish and dangerous, but there was no scholarship on these groups. Indeed, to the best of my knowledge, I published the very first article on 4th and 5th step groups, which was surprising given their ubiquity in Mexico and the United States. And the movement's founder of 4th and 5th step groups, his name is Padrino Mario Gomez, I'll mention him a few times, credits me for visibilizing his movement and chronicling its history, which has been part of my work. So my method of research has been primarily ethnographic, but I have collaborated with 2 colleagues at Stanford University's Department of Psychiatry, Drs. Brian Anderson and Keith Humphreys, to design, pilot, and validate a binational survey of 4th and 5th step groups in the US. And the resulting data from over 100 surveys supplements my qualitative findings. And I will say I was very wary about survey research. It's something I had never done, but I actually found a lot of the data that we got to be very helpful in understanding the complexity of these groups. So these groups were first established in Mexico City in 1991 at a time when the circumstances of poor Mexicans took a turn for the worse due to a weakening economy. Addictions to alcohol and drugs skyrocketed at the same period. 12-step programs, especially Alcoholics Anonymous, are widely available throughout the country, but their philosophy and traditions, according to Padrino Mario Gomez, didn't align with the culture and struggles of poor people in Mexico. Not only is AA's 90-minute format considered limiting because the working poor needed to be able to access meetings 24 hours a day, but the program lacked a strong spiritual element that was Catholic in orientation. According to Padrino Mario, alcoholics, addicts, and enfermos, meaning those with, in this context, mental health problems, didn't just need steps to end their addictions or illnesses. They needed what he called spiritual nourishment. So Padrino Mario distilled the 12 steps into 2 steps, focusing on what he saw as the root cause of suffering, the refusal to acknowledge one's wrongdoing and pain, and the need to confess or share them. In an interview with me, he described practicing 4th and 5th step as hard, intimate work, and when performed well, capable of inspiring interpersonal trust and reciprocity between group members. These bonds, he said, lessened loneliness and fear and led to healing that extended far beyond AA's focus on individual addiction. So the first 4th and 5th step group in the United States was established in Los Angeles in 1992. And its initial members, who I interviewed, were undocumented men who experienced the hardships of being separated from their families and finding work and housing and all of those things. At the time, anti-immigrant sentiment was brewing, culminating in California's Prop 187. The Save Our State initiative sought to deny access to healthcare, public education, and public services to undocumented immigrants. It also required local and state agencies to report undocumented people to state and federal immigration authorities. The controversial proposition passed in 1994 but was never initiated. Still, it sowed lasted fear in the minds of undocumented immigrants whose use of public mental health services and primary care plummeted across the state. And you can only imagine what is happening now with the current administration and the threats against undocumented immigrants today. The gap in healthcare usage due to fears of deportation, ongoing anxiety about one's legal status, and practical issues like work and housing led to the spread of fourth and fifth step groups across the border states. Significantly, Anexos also proliferated in the US during this time, and many adhered to the fourth and fifth step group model. By 2014, my research team identified 23 fourth and fifth step groups in the San Francisco Bay Area alone. So I turn now to a discussion of a group located in Oakland, California, and to the ritual of the experience. I came to learn of this group through my research on Anexos in the United States. As it is sometimes said, donde hay mexicanos, hay anexos. Where there are Mexicans, there are anexos. Between 2018 and 2023, I studied this Anexos, which is exclusively for women. The Anexo is in the Fruitvale district in Oakland, in a one-bedroom apartment on top of a garage that is set back from the street. There's no sign announcing its presence, and its entrance is in the back of the building, shielding it from view. At the time of my first visit, 7 women lived there. All were undocumented, and 3 had voluntarily committed themselves to the Anexo, which is notably different from Anexos in Mexico, where people are almost always committed involuntarily by family members, usually mothers. 2 women were committed by their mothers due to drug addiction, and 2 were committed because of debilitating depression. The madrina, or godmother and sponsor, who ran the place was also undocumented. She established the Anexo in 2012 with the needs of women like her in mind. Madrina Trini is short and energetic with blue-black short hair and deep brown eyes framed with purple liner. She was a beautician back home in Chihuahua, where she owned her own salon in a 2-bedroom cement block house. Chihuahua, of course, is a border state and home to Ciudad Juarez, which once had the highest homicide rate in the world due to intercartel violence and corrupt military and police. By 2010, 20% of Ciudad Juarez's inhabitants fled violence for El Paso, which lies directly across the border, or to other destinations in the US and Mexico. In 2006, the year Mexico's war on narcos officially commenced, Madrina Trini's husband immigrated to Oakland at the advice of a friend. The Bay Area was booming due to its tech industry, and there were construction jobs to be had. The money he sent back home to Chihuahua was good, Madrina Trini told me, but much of it ended up in the hands of extortionists. Madrina Trini's daughters and their families relocated to central Mexico, where the security situation wasn't as bad as in the border state. They wanted their mother to come with them, but she felt like everyone would be better off if she joined her husband and worked in the US, so she could send money home to her children. During one of our interviews, Madrina Trini described her migrant journey to California. She said, and this is quite difficult to hear, but it's important. While crossing, I was raped. After I crossed, I was raped. Rape is part of what we are told to expect. The shelters on the other side warn you. They tell us that it's safest to cross on your period or right after, that way you can't get pregnant. Even old ladies like me, you pay with your bodies, but you're never ready for it. The experience of violence, including sexual assault, is common during migrant journeys, and studies show that at least 1 in 4 female migrants experience sexual violence, although the rate is likely much higher, as women are likely to underreport the crime because of stigma and fear of deportation. Indeed, nearly half of migrant women reported sexual violence in the survey we conducted of fourth and fifth step group members in the United States. These crimes were not committed only by smugglers. My findings support other reports that document high rates of human rights violations by Border Patrol agents including beatings and rape. When Madrina Trini finally arrived in Oakland, she discovered that her husband lived with several other men in a small apartment. It was no place for a woman, she told me, especially after her traumatic journey across the border. Most of the men left during the day to find day labor, but a few hung back and they frightened Madrina Trini. Her husband did too. She described him as a good man back in Mexico, but something in him had changed since he arrived in the United States. He was no longer gentle, she told me. The Bay Area housing bubble burst and construction jobs dwindled. Soon, 7 men in the apartment became 9, and they drank. The situation was intolerable for Madrina Trini. One afternoon, she came upon a flyer on the window of a beauty shop that catered to Oakland's Latino community. It was for a 4th and 5th step group. Madrina Trini knew of such groups in Mexico, but never went. Lonely and afraid, she decided to go. It is often said that one needs to reach a bottom before healing can occur. In this scenario, healing or recovery presumes an upward trajectory, a distancing of the self from the source of pain and a growing invulnerability to it. But feminist scholars have argued that there is no bottom for women. Instead, women experience ongoing vulnerability. Philosopher Adriana Cavarero notes that the term vulnus or wound is embedded in the term vulnerability. She writes, as a body, the vulnerable one remains vulnerable as long as she lives, exposed at any instant to the vulnus. Yet, the same potential also delivers her healing. Madrina Trini described her anexo and the 4th and 5th step group she attended as having this dual quality of vulnerability. Like her anexo, the 4th and 5th step group was not only a place of last resort for women vulnerable to sickness, abandonment, or oppression, it was also a gathering of women whose mutual vulnerability inspired interdependence and care, which is also, I found, a dynamic very similar in the anexos that I studied. Giving testimony, or confessing, as it is called in the context of 4th and 5th step groups, is one of the group's main activities. Those at the group Madrina Trini attended were often devastating, the testimonies. Women recounted migrant journeys like her own. They expressed fear of deportation and lamented their inability to travel home to see dying parents and children left behind. Some suffered from chronic illnesses, but were afraid to seek medical help. Securing and maintaining housing was a constant struggle, especially with downturn in jobs and rising rents. Kids suffered in school, and mothers worried about gangs and family members back in Mexico. They suffered from oppression, depression, and nerves. At the same time, their shared feelings of loss, grief, and worry enabled recognition and mutual support. Madrina Trini took her charge to the 4th and 5th step group at least twice a week. I accompanied her on several occasions. The group met, or still meets, in a rundown storefront with windows covered in white paint. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in rows that faced a podium, much like we are today. Madrina Trini was the sponsor of several women in the group, and they approached her with hugs and donations of food for her anexo. They asked about her children back in Mexico, and Madrina Trini smiled when she talked about a new granddaughter. Moments later, she furrowed her brow with a look of concern when a woman mentioned another massacre in Chihuahua, not far from where her family once lived. A coordinator named Andreas welcomed everyone to the meeting while another passed a basket for donations. Some had nothing to give, others tossed in $1 or $2 or loose change. While the basket made its way around the room, Andreas led the group in a recitation of the Lord's Prayer, Padre nuestro que estás en el cielo. There were several announcements. A new nonprofit provided relief funds for undocumented immigrants. On weekends, a free dental care mobile clinic could be found on International Ave Boulevard. In the back of the room, there was a new fact sheet about workers and tenants' rights. A few of the attendees took notes, and others checked their cell phones. During my first visit to the group, Andreas announced that there was a new person in the room. I waited for the newcomer to stand and introduce themselves, but Andreas was referring to me. At his invitation, I went up to the podium. Faces looked at me warily or encouragingly. I introduced myself much the same way I did in Mexico City, saying I was a researcher interested in healing from addictions and emotional illnesses. But this time I added that I was from the community and that I suffered from depression for most of my life. It was a spontaneous admission. Who was your sponsor? Someone shouted at me. Madrina Trini stood. I am, she said. Fourth and fifth step group attendees are not considered full-fledged members until they have their experiencia, the 3-day ritual focused on the intensive practice of fourth and fifth steps. The experience is intended to facilitate a cathartic release of painful memories and emotions that are considered the root of suffering and illness. Participants are taken to a remote place, far from the realities of everyday life. In Southern California, initiates are usually taken to the desert, and in Northern California, the forest. In these wilds, there is nothing to seek but truth and salvation. After the experience, members are expected to regularly attend fourth and fifth step meetings. Many undergo another experience within a year or two, both to atone for wrongdoings and to seek a release from the accumulation of pain built over time. They also go to attend and guide and accompany new initiates on their journey. After my first fourth and fifth step group meeting, Madrina Trini said it would be necessary for me to undergo an experience if I wanted to continue my participation in the group. At the time, I wasn't sure how much further I wanted to pursue research, and I felt professional pressure to just finish up and write a book. But I was aware that I had discovered a self-help movement in the United States for which there was no written documentation, at least not at the time. And from what I could gather, the movement had grown considerably during President Trump's first term. I wanted to understand the concerns of undocumented immigrants in the increasingly hostile political climate, as well as how they cared for each other under the duress of deportation. To move forward with the experience, I needed to attend 7 preparatory meetings. The first introduced me to AA literature and the way testimonies are delivered during the ritual. Andreas warned me that the testimonies can be difficult if one was not prepared. I assured him that I had seen harrowing testimonies in Mexico City's anexos, where anexados, as the residents are called, give oral testimony for hours under the threatening watch of a counselor. But Andreas rejected the comparison, insisting that their method of testimony was different. Rather than taking a few hours as in an anexo, testimonies unfold over the course of days and in a different modality. At the time, he did not elaborate. 13 people attended the preparatory meetings, including me. Many rushed in late, apologizing for delayed buses and long work hours. Andreas tried to weed out the people who weren't dedicated to the work that lay ahead. Maybe it's not time for you, he said to a man who stumbled into the building with alcohol on his breath. But we all affirmed our commitment. And when we were asked why we wanted to undergo the experience, we responded alike. We wanted to be released from pain. One woman wanted to put the memory of her traumatic migrant journey behind her. An 18-year-old needed to stop using meth. A man talked about his overpowering rage, which he also had suffered at the hands of his father when he was a child. And a woman cried when describing a brother who had been disappeared in Mexico. There were alcoholics, drug addicts, and people with crippling anxiety. And then there was me, the depressed anthropologist. We reviewed the fourth and fifth step of the 12 steps, which were the centerpiece of the experience. Step 4, make a searching and fearless inventory of ourselves. Step 5, admit to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. These steps, Andreas said, demanded heightened states of honesty and vulnerability when reflecting on the past. We also learned the serenity prayer, held hands, and recited the Lord's Prayer in Spanish. Finally, we were introduced to the various roles of the participants in the experience. As expected, padrinos and madrinas would direct the ritual. With them were apoyos, helpers, who continuously supervised the initiates, never leaving their sides. The helpers were shadowed by oyentes, listeners, who are still in the process of learning the ritual by following helpers in word and example. And the initiates were called escribientes. Writers? I asked Andreas. Yes, writers. After the last preparatory meeting, Andreas pulled me aside. He needed to know whether my role at the experience, what it would be. Would I attend as an anthropologist or as an escribiente, a writer? Andreas listened patiently while I explained that my role as an anthropologist was to participate and observe, and that my subsequent writings were based on this dual practice. But this wasn't what Andreas meant. He looked at me closely. To undergo an experience, the writing must come first. We departed on a Friday evening in August. There were 9 of us. 4 people had left the group for unknown reasons. We crammed into a white passenger van with 2 rows of seating. Before we entered the vehicle, we were patted down and searched for drugs. Our cell phones and watches were taken away. The only window in the cab was in the front. Night fell quickly, and the headlights of oncoming cars lit up the faces of the group. Some people chatted while others stayed quiet with pensive looks on their faces. I sat next to Lupe, a woman from Jalisco. Lupe was undocumented and worked as a cleaning woman in office buildings in Palo Alto. Her shift was from 7 to 12 at night, when office buildings were supposed to be empty. But people always worked late, and when Lupe knocked on the door of an office to empty waste baskets, she was shooed away. She worried about not being able to do her job. Lupe had 3 children at home, and rent for her 1-bedroom apartment was high. She developed nervios. She left her children behind with her sister, who had underwent the experience 6 months earlier. Her sister called the ritual life-changing, but didn't provide details about it because her padrino instructed her not to. There's a great air of secrecy around these experiences, a secrecy that I'm aware that I am breaking as I talk about them today. Despite the preparatory meeting, Lupe wasn't ready for what lay ahead. I felt the same way. Someone began singing a traditional religious hymn. The singing didn't last long. I was going to sing a little bit of a few, but I'll not. The singing didn't last long, and for much of the trip, people sat in silence. Time passed slowly, and the sound of traffic eventually died down. The road turned bumpy. We bounced around in the dark van, laughing nervously. The van finally stopped, and for several minutes, we waited inside while a flurry of activity took place around us. Finally, the door slid open, and the smell of forest perfumed the chilly air. I stepped out and looked upward toward the dark tips of redwoods pointing at an indigo sky. 2 helpers guided each initiate to a large open-air tent where a long conference table was lit by kerosene lamps. At least a dozen initiates from another 4th and 5th step group was already seated at the table, and 20 or so people stood around it, watching us as we approached. I was relieved to see Madrina Trini among them. She wore a flannel shirt and rain boots, prepared for whatever weather may come. Bienvenidos, escribientes, welcome writers. We joined the other writers at the table, each of us seated between our designated helpers. Behind us stood our listener, their hands resting on our shoulders, steadying us, or perhaps holding us down. My listener's fingers were slender and young. I turned to look at him, and he looked down at me. A tattoo of a spider caught in a web spread across his neck. A young drug addict sat across from me across the table from me. His hands trembled as he lifted a styrofoam cup of coffee to his lips. I didn't know it at the time, but coffee and hot chocolate would be our main source of sustenance for the next 72 hours. Inducing hunger was part of the experience. An elaborate stereo system was set up beneath a second tent. Toma las lágrimas, take my tears, rang the voice of a woman. Padrino Alberto, who would lead the experience, stood at the head of the table. He had a square face, spiky black hair, and wore a leather jacket. I'd seen him before in videos posted on YouTube that I studied before the experience. One video garnered over 800,000 views. It showed him preaching into a microphone while a man strummed a guitar. Padrino Alberto talked over this soundtrack. Escribientes, you're here because you are in pain. He paused for a long time, looked around the table, his gaze resting on each one of us. The Padrino's voice gathered momentum as he spoke about our lack of authority over our lives. He talked in a mixture of Spanish and English, describing how we would come face to face with this lack of authority during the experience because we would never be alone. God was omnipresent. Plus, on a more practical level, we would always be accompanied by three people who would watch over us every minute, two helpers and a listener. Why? Because writers take advantage. They bring drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. They violate when they begin to feel what it is to lose their power. And they will not succeed because they will always be outnumbered, not only by the three people assigned to each writer, but by El Señor, Jesus Christ, whose presence could be felt in the forest. Padrino Alberto launched into his own story, describing how his life back in Mexico was ruled by drugs and violence. He said he carried a gun around him with him because of the sense of power it gave him. I killed three people, including my cousin, he yelled. Whether or not it was true, we writers took notice, and Padrino Alberto seemed to grow in size. Power led to violence, he shouted at us, humility to peace. The padrinos and madrinas that stood in the background offered amens and deeply felt sighs. Padrino Alberto continued talking about his fall into disgrace due to a lack of humility. But then his wife arranged for him to go to an anexo. It was in a one-room house filled with 30 men in the Chihuahuan desert, and there he possessed nothing, only his own wretchedness. For 6 months, he was forced to practice steps 4 and 5, beginning with childhood memories. Childhood, he said, is when the pain begins to build and when we begin to seek to escape it. But the pain only gets worse. In the desert, he practiced steps 4 and 5 every day, while every night he wrote and cried. Then I reached catharsis, he exclaimed. Now we were on the same journey, the journey of writers. There were small folding tables scattered throughout the campsite, and each writer was led to one of them by their helpers. The tables were lit by kerosene lamps, but darkness pressed all around them, giving them a stage-like appearance. A stack of paper was anchored by a rock, and 3 pens arranged in neat rows. My helpers sat on either side of me and my listener across. Their faces were shadowy and the paper glared at me empty. We held hands and bowed our head in prayer. One of the helpers asked God to give me patience and courage and to write in search of truth and forgiveness. The other helper removed a sheet from the stack and placed it in front of me. Her hands were small and shot through with blue veins. Write your first memory, she said, handing me a pen. The first thing that occurred to me was sitting knees to chest in a coat closet. The woman took the paper and read it aloud in a gentle voice. Then she looked at me and asked me how old I was at the time and why was I in a coat closet. I started to speak, but she passed the paper back to me. Write it down, she said. I was 4, maybe 5 years old. I preferred small spaces, little rooms where I might be found. The woman took the paper from me. So you're not hiding? She asked. No, write it down. I was not hiding. The helpers asked seemingly simple questions about my family members and age of certain events, such as my first communion and menstruation. As instructed, I wrote answers to their questions. My sentences were precise and appeared as fragments loosely connected by memory. Every 10 sentences or so, a helper took the paper and read my responses out loud. I stared at the listener sitting across the table from me. The flickering light between us gave the illusion that the spider on his neck was moving. At the first signs that I was growing tired, my listener was ordered to bring me coffee. I watched him walk off into the darkness and questioned, somehow my helpers and listeners were able to stay alert, but I was exhausted. I sipped the acrid coffee, aware of the sound of someone weeping in the background. I heard rustling and turned to see pages falling from another table. Right, my helper said, turning my attention back to the paper. A few hours into the writing session, Padrino Alberto began to clap, signaling that it was time to wrap up. To my surprise, dawn was breaking and we had written throughout the night. We returned to the clearing and instead of rest, were forced to do jumping jacks, stretch, and run in place, our breath visible in the chilly air. The young addict whimpered and others complained that they felt faint. I felt it too, but tried to keep up, remembering the anexados I studied in Mexico City who were forced to run in circles around the perimeter of their little rooms. A madrina shouted at us. Her voice was loud and shrill, and she zigzagged through our bodies while calling them gifts from God that we abused with alcohol and drugs. Other people abused our bodies without remorse, she said. She named the perpetrators, spouses, employers, drug dealers, criminals, smugglers, and abortionists. Our duty was to protect our bodies and the lives of innocents who depended on them. And for this, we needed to be strong and accept the authority of God. She singled out the women in the group and asked who had had an abortion. When no one responded, she called us liars and murderers of the innocent, no better than Padrino Alberto once was back when he killed his cousin. Her talk of abortion angered me, and I struggled to stay silent. I looked to Madrina Trini for help, remembering her stories about rape during dangerous migrant journeys. How many girls and women crossed over into this country and sought out abortions or wanted to, but were too afraid because they were undocumented? 2 months earlier, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, making it impossible for millions of women in the United States to get an abortion. I was relieved when Padrino Alberto stepped in, turning our attention to the male writers. He singled out a heavy man and demanded that he run faster. The writer bounced up and down, panting. Padrino Alberto said his weight was an impediment to work and the ability to contribute to the needs of his family. It was a sign of selfishness and an insult to those in hunger. The Padrino accused him of taking from others to stuff himself. Then he turned to the young drug addict. His addiction was not merely a sign of moral failing or biological disease, Padrino Alberto said, but abuse of his family, who he stole from to satisfy his urges. Both men were accused of being thieves and ordered to kneel and admit to God the nature of their wrongs. I am selfish, a thief. I abuse my body, a thief. After our morning exercise, we washed our hands and faces in a bucket of cold water. Then we were instructed to sit on the ground. It was cold and damp. Our helpers brought us coffee and a cinnamon roll, our only food until evening. Then they doled out the medications. I was among the enfermos, the sick ones, who held out their hands and swallowed pills. In the afternoon, each rider was led by their helpers and listener on a silent walk around the campsite. The ground was slippery with dark green needles and the trees alive with birds, thrush, hummingbirds, jays. Lupe passed by me, her arms spread out by her sides, as if balancing herself on a high wire. When night fell, we riders returned to our tables, a new stack of paper waiting for us. The empty paper stared at me, its blue lines blurred due to darkness and lack of sleep. I held the hands of my helpers. We bowed our heads and asked God to give me strength to be vulnerable and hold nothing back. The first prompt that night was to write about my most distressing memory. I thought for a while and began to write. That night, I wrote pages and pages of memories, ages 15, 42, 17, 12, time not in chronological order, but a mix dictated by processes that felt mysterious to me. Why this memory and not another? Why mother and not father? Occasionally, the helpers brought me coffee or took the pen and rubbed my sore hand. I wept and they told me to keep writing. When the fog turned icy, my listener brought me a blanket and placed it around my shoulders. The moisture in the air caused the blue ink to bleed, forming what looked like bruises across the paper. At times, I became aware of the sounds around me, sniffling, words of encouragement, reprimands. The young drug addict vomited behind a tree and complained he was freezing. When I walked to the bathroom, accompanied again by my helpers, I caught a glimpse of his paper. The only word I can make out was stop. I wondered about the content of the other writers' pages. What memories were being awakened? What sentences were helpers and listeners reflecting to my fellow writers? And again, this is where some of the survey data is helpful, because one of the most prevalent issues that fourth and fifth step group members who were on the experience described writing about was memories of violence in Mexico, fears of deportation, and stress about making ends meet. I remember reading somewhere that Kafka had a hard time finishing his stories because they caused him such anguish. He'd often begin a story and abandoned it, because if he didn't let go, he would never be able to come back to the world. Do I live now in another world? He asked in one of his diaries. Do I dare say it? For Kafka, to write was to abandon the self and surrender to the work. The demand to write during the experience did not aspire to art, but the exercise of writing became the experience of living in another world. The shadowy atmosphere of the woods, the reflection of words back onto the writers, and the constant gaze of the helpers and listeners upon us, all of this led to a feeling of surrender of the self to the work at hand. The initiate's work became one of writing, recollection, reflection, purgation. The work at hand was tragedy. Tragedy gives voice to what one suffers in us and in others, and how we might become cognizant of that suffering, Simon Critchley writes. It stirs emotion, especially fear and pity, and these emotions become the grounds for what Aristotle called catharsis. Though Aristotle never defines it directly, catharsis is often understood as a ritualistic process of purification, one that requires a stage, like tragedy. That is what the small tables in the woods appeared to me as, tiny stages where individual tragedies were performed and observed. At one point, Madrina Trini walked over to our table and took a page from the pile held by one of my helpers. She stood above me, appearing as a gleaming face emerging from darkness. I watched her lips as she silently read my text. She met my gaze when she was finished. Go on, she said, as she handed the paper back to me. In the 1930s, Georges Bataille started a secret community and journal he called Acéphale, Headless. Acéphale was both a protest of Nazism and fascism of the day and a celebration of creativity in the face of political disaster. The community that it envisaged was related to an ecstatic practice that called for an entirely different way of being. Like wrenching crying or violent laughter, writing was among the experiences that could rupture the individual as they existed in normal everyday life. There was an element of Acéphale during the experiencia's nocturnal writing practices. Among the forms of violence that marked the moment were the atrocious acts against undocumented immigrants, hostile rhetoric, ICE raids, rape, families separated, kids in cages. These experiences of violence were partly what motivates Anexos, fourth and fifth step groups, and the journey to the forest. Meanwhile, we writers, seated at our wobbly tables, were pushed to an absolute limit. Deprived of sleep, our minds became saturated with painful memories. Deprived of food, our stomachs growled with hunger. The mental and physical elements of our individual deprivations amplified a sense of vulnerability and singularity. Yet we were never alone, not with helpers and listeners by our sides, reading aloud and listening to our words, ready to respond to our individual needs. Looking over the text I produced over the course of 2 nights, I can sense the breakdown that gradually overtook me. It isn't just what I wrote, spider on his table neck, our heart bleeds fast. It's my handwriting, and it's unraveling to the point where I can only make out certain recurring refrains. Hand spasm, blurry girl, recollect the collection. And more than my individual text, my breakdown, which was simultaneously my healing, was produced and expressed in the shared experience of writing. On the final evening of the experience, before our writing practice began, I sat next to Adela, one of Madrina Trini's goddaughters. She looked to be in her 60s, older than Madrina Trini, but with a playful demeanor that made her seem younger than her age. She spoke with an accent that carried the melody of an indigenous tongue foreign to me. This forest reminds me of home, Adela said, looking at the soaring redwoods. We were quiet for a while, heavy with fatigue. Then she took my hand. Her palms were smooth as silk, and she said that the trees were strong. The previous evening, I noticed how during the writing practice, Adela spoke her memories to her listener, who transcribed them on paper for her. It was an arrangement so distinct from loneliness. I imagined her voice, a sonority resounding among gathering trees, her concert hall. What brought this woman to the forest? She must have sensed my question because she turned to me and said, I am finally writing my story. As it so often happens with gentleness, and Dufomantel writes, there is a double gift that appears. The one who offers it and the one who receives it are both brought together. I received this gift of togetherness through the gesture of a fellow writer taking my hand in the forest and through the practice of writing itself. The helper's conjuring of memory and recitation of my words, the listener's steady gaze on me, a witness to my grief. What characterized the experience was a reciprocal communication between writer, helper, listener. To be a writer meant being together, exhausted, hungry, dizzy, encouraging, ecstatic, receptive, grieving, hurting, gentle, and never alone. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Now we'll take some questions. We'll move back and forth between those on the Zoom. And in fact, we have a real live audience here. So would you mind taking your
Yeah,
questions?
I'm happy to take them. Any questions or comments, Lawrence?
So many, but just to throw a few in.
Lauren, hang on just 1 second. The people on Zoom, I'm gonna just stand next to you awkwardly so that the people on Zoom can hear you. Yeah.
Just elements, if any, pills, secrecy, writing, literacy and illiteracy. I mean, in the end, that comes out. So the question makes sense to me now in a different way. But yeah, and why the 1920s and 30s Kafka and Bataille? Is there something that? And then finally, the iteration reminds me of our colleagues, the Assadians, and of your colleague Tanya Luhrmann in different ways. But is there something in the iteration that pushes in a certain way?
The turn to Kafka and Bataille in particular, and I turned to Bataille in a much more reading of this piece, is the set of that he experimented with incidents. And I find in those writing practices and in some of his analyses of the kinds of practices that his secret community participated in, to be very reminiscent of the spirit of the experience and of the desire to rip oneself out of their present and go into another world and experience something different than what they would then turn to when they left on Sunday morning. And so I began to think about, SFL and what Bataille tried to create. And I very much see Mario Gomez, the Padrino that started these groups, as really being deliberate about wanting to start something, a ritual, a community that was based in a practice of writing, primarily, at least initially, before going into the fourth and step readings, where elements of the writing practice are also evident. So I just began to think about different ways that different kinds of political constituencies come together. And indeed, I see these people that go into the forest, undocumented women, men, young people. Actually, a lot of teenagers attend as well at the request of their parents as kind of a boot camp type situation. But I see them as seeking a cathartic experience. And I think that a lot of what Bataille was talking about too, that the limit experience is being something that edges toward catharsis, but maybe never quite gets there, but nevertheless is this kind of release. So that's why I've become interested in Bataille. And iteration, in what way do you mean?
I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of work on iteration, but the in general as a mode of thinking about the religious and about the condition of ethical becoming. But writing is so specific, and the demands so extraordinarily offered are so specific. So I was just really guess, is there a turn to this, if you like, this general grammar of iteration that comes to us?
Well, one of the things that's sort of interesting is that in his Padrino, Mario wanted to be a teacher, and he placed a lot of so he was very committed to the practice of writing as a form of self-development and a form of healing. And I think sometimes, I interviewed him about his desires to become a teacher and why writing. Why writing, particularly for a community where writing is very challenging and may not even be accessible. And so that the helpers, who are literally writing out the memories of someone like Adela, what is shared in that, and then having it repeated back to you, and then to hear one's own words, there was something about that, having your words speak from the mouth of another, reflected back to you, and then just that continual process of putting more words to paper to have them read back to you. There is a sense of not only an ethical becoming and also release, but of a sense of community, which is really what I'm getting at, because the everyday lives of so many of the people that go on these experiences are incredibly lonely, and they're filled with anxiety, and there's fear, and really a sense, increasingly so, of desperation. And so something occurs in the experiencia that is very much a release from that, in part because the insistence that you write that you go there and you write it and you have it reflected back to you and you keep going until you can no longer go. And I definitely see in that not only a source, a sense of ethical becoming, but also of becoming of community. And so that's kind of where I'm headed to in this work.
If I can bring in one question from the folks on Zoom. The talk ended with a cliffhanger. You decided to break the secrecy. Please give us some closure. I want to know if you would do it again, to say the least.
Yes.
Thanks.
I've done it twice. And I do plan on doing it again because I'm writing something, and I'm really ambivalent about it. It's a piece for the New York Times, and I'm struggling with how to write a piece for such a broad audience about such a delicate subject right now. I guess there's no resolution. I do know that these groups are spreading. They've become even more. The group in Oakland that I attended for a number of years has swelled in population. Experiencias are ongoing. I have the schedule. There are many of them coming up, particularly during the summer months where it's a little bit warmer. So they're going to continue. And so there's really at this point no resolution that I could speak of, other than this is a growing movement. It's one that I've sought solace in personally, and that I think holds a tremendous potential as a space for people who otherwise don't go to a healthcare setting to receive support and, again, a sense of community. You will have to read the book to find out what some of because I write about the experience in the book. And I go into more detail about my own breakdown. What I want to do now, which I have not yet been able to do, is read the writing of others that are on the Experiencia. What happens after the final ritual is the burning of the writing. I have been able to hold on to my writing, with permission. So I have my own sort of journals that I created, but I don't have them from others. All I have are like survey data that say, this is what we wrote about. Because there's meant to be very intimate, shared only with the 4 people at the table, and then burned. And so that's where I think there's a bit of a cliffhanger, because I haven't really analyzed the words of the others that have joined me in this ritual. And I would love to, but I haven't yet had the strength to ask, or the will to ask someone for that yet. Partly because I recognize how deeply intimate it is, how deeply intimate it was for myself. And I almost feel that I could talk to people about their writing, but I can't yet ask them to let me read it and analyze it for the purposes of my work. And part of that reason is I was terribly moved by this experience, and I see its value, and I don't want to interfere in that in any way as a researcher. So I want to be present. I want to be beside people, but I don't necessarily want to say, okay, now show me what you wrote. So there is a bit of a cliffhanger there. But I will go back and do this again. Ellie?
Thank you. And thank you for the book. As I told you, we really enjoyed teaching it in class this past quarter. I had a couple of questions. I'll try to be really brief. One of the things I think is really interesting about the book and the work in Annexos, and then also the experience that you talked about today, is the way in which the sort of the starting point is addiction of some kind, but it doesn't stay within those boundaries at all. It sort of becomes a much wider umbrella of pain and experience, life experience, and that is inclusive in that. And that's so different than a medical model or a public health model, which bifurcates even sort of mental health from addiction often. So I was wondering about sort of what difference you feel like that makes to bring that together and creating community, and sort of not having the condition of even the kind of substance you use or your experience with, or even if you identify as someone who's addicted as opposed to someone who maybe does have a substance use issue that you're trying to figure out, but that's not really the pain that you're trying to get through. So that's one question. And then the second question is related, which is just about, there's sort of been a move in anthropology to think about the limits of language and writing and the ethnographic to capture and represent and even put in conversation, broadly the world, but let's say specifically, even thinking about spaces of addiction, and then thinking about Todd Meyer's most recent book, Gone Gone, is sort of a provocation in that, and we read that together. And so I guess I'm wondering, with your experience with this and with writing, has it made you think differently about that moment in anthropology, or the power of the ethnographic or of writing itself? Has that made you think about that any differently?
Yeah, I'll take that first and just say that I am really excited by a lot of current ethnographies that are exploring writing. I've learned a lot about writing through the experience. I've learned in surprising ways. One of the things that I've learned is to think of writing as less a solo act, less a mode of self-expression or self-exploration, even though I'm certainly exploring elements of my own history in the book. I see writing as more of a conduit that is not limiting, but is more enabling. And so I'm trying to think of not so much the limits of language, but the expansiveness of language and what language can do. And even in some of the sentences that I wrote, that I have, like when I was writing, for example, recollect the collection. Like that kept coming up in my writing, and I think about what that means, and how the work of recollection, which is something that the helpers really are, working to make happen. It's kind of exceeds any kind of model that is like a limit of language. It's more, again, just this idea of language emerges in so many different ways and in so many different unanticipated places and unanticipated even models or forms of expression. And so I'm really excited about how this work, I mean, if there's any limit, it's the limit of sense, because at some point there's just complete breakdown. And the breakdown is the thing. It's not necessarily the narrative. But you get to the breakdown through the narrative, and you get there because there's someone else working with you the entire time. So for me, the nature of writing has changed somewhat. I think about my helpers and listener while I'm writing. I imagine what they might ask me, or how they might respond, or what their voice might be like when they read the text back to me. And that's changed the writing process for me pretty significantly. It's not that I'm imagining a reviewer. It's that I hear my helper reading to me, and that makes me think about cadence differently, syntax, what it is I really want to say. And it's just created a whole different resonance. And like Anexos, addiction is not the thing. I mean, people have addiction problems. It's probably many of us, or people in our family, in our worlds, they go to these ostensibly because of issues around addiction, particularly to drugs. But like in Nexos, no one really talked about drugs. When we had our activities, our joint activities together, no one really spoke about drugs. I mean, there were a few times, like the young meth addict who I kind of was concerned about him detoxing. Because I worked in a detox clinic, I knew that there were certain dangers around detox. So I was kind of watching him very carefully. But for the most part, addiction is not the issue. There's a structure of the 12 steps, or the 2 steps that bring people in. But what is actually worked through is very rarely addiction itself. And similarly, in Anexos, very few people talked about drugs, partly because it's not safe to talk about drugs. I didn't ask about drugs, but the issues were largely violence that exists beyond the Anexos walls, not the violence of addiction itself for the individual. So it's a very different way of conceiving things. Not to say again that addiction is not an issue, but many people were there because of they were neuroticos, they had neurosis. So it's just sometimes the way that it's phrased, or they were enfermos, they had various ailments or sicknesses, and they were everyone collectively seeking release from those things, not seeking recovery from addiction. But I think it's wonderful that all of these people can be together in the same space in the forest or in the desert, and face these things together.
Maybe we take another question.
Yeah.
And my observation, I'm thinking also Akhil Gupta's book, Red Tape, and his understanding about writing, bureaucratic writing, and how it is that bureaucrats spend all of their time writing in India and no one ever reads what they're writing. And he says that that's a conjuring of the state. So it's a very interesting sort of way. What is conjured here by this form of writing, which precisely, is meant to be read aloud in the context, but not meant to be read beyond the perimeters of that context. So what gets conjured? And I love what you were saying about how it taught you more about writing.
Yeah.
But of course, all of that is my way of prefacing the fact that I have a really good question here that I'm going to ask. So I wonder if Dr. Garcia could speak a little bit more about how she's exploring and theorizing healing in this project, particularly in relationship to the intensification of xenophobia and racism in our contemporary political climate. She spoke a little bit about how feminist theories of healing attend to the sense of ongoingness of trauma in relationship to gender and sexual violence. I'm wondering if she could say a bit more about that in relationship to the undocumented experience specifically. How do you heal when the violence is ongoing and intensifies?
What a question.
Yeah.
Beautifully posed and difficult to answer. I would say the ongoingness of violence and alienation requires an ongoingness to projects of healing, with the knowledge that any kind of experience of healing, any kind of cathartic experience is a temporary one. And in fact, many people that go on these experiences go back again and again and again, not only as initiates who need to go through the writing ritual, but as helpers and as listeners. And so their position changes within the group. And with that change, a different kind of healing occurs, in that they become almost like facilitators of someone else's healing journey. And I think that it is a journey, it's ongoing. And when I turn to sort of the feminist ethics of care and of woundedness and of narrative, I think about, you know, the temporality of pain and the temporality of healing are just very different. And there's the desire for a rupture and the knowledge that you're going to go back to your communities, you're going to experience it again. So what do you have waiting for you? Well, you have the groups that you can go to in Oakland, you have the communities of people, you have the handouts that help with things like, you know, free dental clinics and those kinds of resources. And it's just it's a scramble. I just see people scrambling to make ends meet. So much of the question about healing is not tended to in the everyday. It's when you have these experiencias where the focus is on healing. So you have this very concerted time, 72 hours, to kind of get it all out before you go back. But then you could return. And so healing then becomes, you know, this iterative process too. I wish I could answer that question more elegantly, but there's a few questions here too.
Yeah.
And then
Thank you so much, and I congratulate you on what you did and what it took to be a participant in that. I think it was probably courageous. I have a couple of questions. One is, I mean, if I understand it correctly, the Experienza is having a group of 4 people. In other words, 2 listeners, 1 helper, and yourself. And everybody has that, which is nobody has that any day of the year.
True.
And already that is just a very, very special experience. And is there any training of the helpers?
yeah. So the training, there's trainers. So there's 2 helpers and a listener. The listener is watching the helpers and they're learning, you know, how to become a helper. The helper learns how to become a helper from the padrino. So there's this hierarchical structure and people are trained. A lot of the helpers are also counselors in other groups. And they've been through the experiencia themselves. Many of them are from Mexico, where they were essentially trained. There are yearly conferences for 4th and 5th step groups in the United States. One was in Las Vegas a couple of years ago that I attended, and there were over 500 groups from the US that were represented. Some people came as far as Pennsylvania, having taken a Greyhound bus to attend this you know, Congress, as it was called. And so, I mean, people are very dedicated to this. And the helpers and the listener, yeah, where else do you get 3 people who are with you throughout the night, you know, 2 nights awake, reading to you, you know, talking to you? I mean, it's just this extraordinary sense of generosity that you can't help but be moved by and want to participate in again, even though it is really grueling. It was something I could never have expected, particularly given our experience with healthcare, the kinds of interactions we have in our own, or even, I mean, it's helped me think about how to be a better reader of my students' work. I mean, it's transformed so many aspects of my life, professionally, writerly, creatively, philosophically. I just feel like this is where the limit of language kind of discourse, I feel like if anything, this has just opened up for me the possibilities of creating a new language of writing, and a new mode of writing that was very unexpected. I had no idea what I was getting into, to be honest. Yeah.
We probably have time for one more question.
I'm Dr. Sia. My name is Christina Lovato, assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare here. I've followed your work for a long time, so I'm so excited to hear you read this. It's so powerful. Your writing is beautiful. And I was just wondering, it sounds like the act of going on the experiencia is what we talk about in social welfare a lot of times is this aspect of providing a culturally congruent, responsive way of providing witness, testimonial, all of that. I'm wondering how, you sort of spoke to it here, how people then reintegrate back into their lives. And you mentioned it a bit, which is they attend groups, they access resources. Is there any more that you could say about the preparation that they might receive in returning back to their home life? And then the second question is just, how did people feel about your dual role?
Well, I think it's very hard. I've interviewed, I've returned to the Anexo in Oakland. So on my first experiencia, I went back to the Anexo after the experience, and I remained there for about a day to calm down, basically, just to, to come down from it. But unless you're going back to an Anexo, you're going back to your everyday life of work, of struggle, of stress, and you have to make that transition very quickly. And I imagine that it's very jarring to have to make that transition. There's this wonderful ethnographic film, The Mad Hatters, Jean Rouge, where there's a colonized community that goes and they perform for 2 days, this radical performance where they don the outfits of, the colonizers, and they have this this amazing ritual, and then they go back to their everyday life where they're laborers and domestic workers, and that's very similar. They just have to go back and they have to pick up the pieces, but they know they have a community, and that's really significant. What was this dual role? My dual role. So when Andrea said to me, "You must come as a writer," I didn't really go in thinking that I was going in as an anthropologist. Of course, that anthropological hat was always on, but I increasingly, as the experience continued, I became less and less an anthropologist with time. I became a member. I became the initiate. I became the writer, and the anthropology, like Andrea said, that comes later. It doesn't come first. And so it's taken me a while to figure out even how to write about this, and particularly given some of the issues around confidentiality and how do I write about these things. I don't want to give anyone a sense of where these things take place, and yet the place is so significant. So in any case, thank you so much for all the questions.
Well,